Hello, hello. Let's talk about using dialogue in your writing. Um, there are certain things that you have to know about using dialogue when you write. One of the biggest things is that you actually need to, every time a new character speaks, you actually have to start a new paragraph. So you cannot have a cluster of characters in one. If someone were to read this, they wouldn't know who was talking. Can I ask you a favor, soul dances in place? I've been chased by vile creatures all night, and I nearly pissed my pants twice. Point me to your can. Before Lennox can step forward, Celeste slaps her brother's shoulder. Shut up. They'll kill you. Well, I want to die without peeing myself. The second offense is enough for Lennox to grab Soul by the throat. Like, that's a little bit too much for a reader to process. The way you can get around that is simply by hitting the enter key every time you end a statement. Now, even that can be a little bit difficult because you don't want to necessarily just jump from conversation to conversation. In other words, another mistake that you can make is by simply having nothing but dialogue, which I believe I have about right here. So you can't have Soul said, I have a few talisman that I like you to enchant. Cammy said, these are ancient and extremely rare. I need to inspect them first. I don't know which spell will work. Soul said, I have the spells and I know the equations for the alchemy. You don't want to do that either because that becomes very boring and very mundane. Instead, you want to interactions. You want to place actions between your words occasionally. Sometimes you want the conversation to flow. We'll go over that next. But other times you want to have a buffer between your words. Let's look at the buffer. I rarely start off a chapter with dialogue, but sometimes you do it for effect. I can't believe that they attacked Brick and accepted you. Godwin's heavy voice carries throughout the room as he holds his stomach to restrain his laughter. After receiving the details of the lengthy report from Soul, the director hasn't stopped grinning. If I ask you two questions, you should be able to answer them quickly. One, who is the subject, or who are we talking about mainly in this paragraph? To that, you should reply with the first name that you see, just Godwin. Secondly, I would say if that is the main character of the paragraph, if that's the main topic, if that's who's speaking the most, then who, or if that's whose actions dominate the paragraph, then who is speaking? And I gave the answer away. It's also Godwin. So you don't have to keep saying Godwin said, Soul said, Laurent said. You don't have to do that. You buffer with their actions. When you're talking to someone and you're holding a natural conversation, in everyday life, you literally bounce conversations back to back for the most part. Like, I say something, you say something. I'm like, ah, ha, ha. You say something, I say something. You say something, I say something. Ah. But that happens. But even in that, there are subtle actions that are occurring. So when you're talking to someone, you might lean back. No, I like that idea. Lean forward, fold your hands on the table. Those are things that you actually have to describe when you're writing because you want your reader to read into emotion. So let's look at this. What emotion are we seeing? Well, we're seeing that this is someone who likes to laugh. We're seeing that he hasn't stopped grinning. So that's a part of his personality. That's who the director is. That's who Godwin is. Well, who is Soul? Soul is generally a similar type of person, but on the other hand, the hunter Soul, has proceeded to clench his jaws uh, since he walked into the room. So ever since Soul walked into the room, he's been clenching his jaws. Now, if you clench your jaws until you get that jawbone muscle here, if you just push down until that jawbone muscle pops out, you'll know that you only do that when you're angry. And so that means that there's some type of frustration or some type of anxiety in the room. It's the same thing as folding your arms. When you say that someone folds their arms, they're either trying to assert dominance or they're trying to prove they're strong or they're angry or they're blocking you out. And so you actually want to pay attention to that body language and add it in. I recommend multiple things when you're writing. One, I recommend that you look at the way that another author writes dialogue. and that is extremely important. You want to almost follow the way that they write dialogue, so you can heighten your transitions between words. That's task number one. Task number two is to make the dialogue flow and be natural at times. So, regardless of how you see another author do it, you still have to hold your own patterns. You should. I'm going to go back. Let me take a step back. You should always have a book near you of that describes things in a certain way. Let me clarify that. You should always have a book near you that of someone whose writing you enjoy, and you want that so you can reference it. I actually always have Jet on my phone by Russell Blake, and he has a similar style to me in that he describes things in a lot of detail. And I like that because I try to create an atmosphere for my reader when they're sitting down. I want them to feel like they can envision the city. But one of the things I learned as an artist is you don't want to paint the full picture. I leave a couple things blank because I know your mind will fill it in. But what I do like is what I can do is I can go and notice in his first chapter, no dialogue, all action. I would never. I think I did that on this one. Yeah, I did that on this one. I rarely do that, but I did it on this one. The second thing is he starts to transition into feeding people into a tidbit of dialogue, and then when the conversation goes back, it flows a certain way. Now, I don't copy his conversation style because I have my own by now. I've written 5 novels of my own. I've published 5 of my own. I've written more, but I use my own style and I introduce things and I flow a certain way. So let's look at the way the conversation bounces back and forth. Here, Hooten takes a sip of Sylvia's disgusting potion while reading Soul's body language. So who's going to be speaking here? Hooten. But Celeste is a shadow walker in a human's 14-year-old body. That's an infant's power that cannot compete with the restored Ramanka. I'll help her through it. So disregards Hooten's anxiety with passion swelling in his voice. Then he turns to Godwin and affirms, Cammy seemed a little suspicious. She knows that you won't be a member of her expedition for a few days. And she doesn't need to know anymore, Godwin asked. So if Godwin, he was talking to Godwin here, but someone else spoke in the middle. You have to ask yourself, who is that? A rule of thumb when you're writing, if you bounce between characters, we know that it's the last person who spoke, the paragraph above. As long as you don't interrupt the flow, you do not need to reintroduce a statement. He said, she said. So the rule is Hooten spoke here. That means Hooten spoke in this one. So Hooten, Soul, Hooten, but Godwin speaks. So I need to say Godwin speaks. Hooten spoke here, but there was a break. There was a transition. So I need to introduce Hooten again. Okay, so that sounds confusing, but hear me out. Oops. Kashif said, hey, how are you? Tiana replied, I'm great. And you? I could be better. Who's speaking? Me. Really? What happened? Kashif. My wife. Okay? So it bounces back and forth. You don't have to keep saying he said, she said. But now what we want to do is we want to transition. I could write again, things are looking really bad for me. And you know I'm speaking, but because we already went 2 lines without anything happening, we want some action. We want movement in the story. How do we add movement? Well, let's not even say Kashif. I always try to stick with, relied. I always try to stick with something that describes another person so that I can use it with their name interchangeably. I'm a writer. And say that I was a writer in this story, well, then I would call me the writer, lowers his head, and pinches his nose. This day has weighed on his heart for since the moment he rolled out of bed. Tears swarmed in Kashif's eyes. So you can see that I am describing an action. Oh gosh. Tell me about it. I don't even need to describe her saying anything again. I could. It would probably be a good idea, but I don't need to. Because we know that Kashif is speaking here. We don't even mention Tiana. So Kashif is dominating this paragraph, the writer. And this is going to progress your story. This is going to give it a flow so that people don't have to keep wondering who's talking, or they don't have to see you mentioning it in a boring way. In creative writing, you have to be creative at all times. So please watch your dialogue, and that will help your story come to life. If you have any questions, email me.